They weren't lost, and that storm wasn't chance. Three women appeared on Reuben Clay's porch like ghosts summoned by guilt itself, silent, soaked, and staring with eyes that didn't beg. They judged. 8 years. That's how long Reuben had vanished into the wilderness, thinking time could bury the truth. But truth doesn't rot. It waits. They knew his name, his crimes. The families left broken in the wake of his greed. They hadn't come for shelter. They came for something he'd spent nearly a decade trying to forget. And as thunder split the sky, Reuben saw it clear. Judgment doesn't always wear a badge or come with a noose. Sometimes it arrives in the shape of three women who lost everything and have nothing left to lose. Reuben Clay wasn't always a man of silence and solitude. Once his voice carried weight in boardrooms and bank halls, where polished shoes clicked confidently on marble floors and promises flowed like ink. He had been trusted, respected, even envied. But respect can be a fragile mask, and trust, once broken, has a way of turning even the most polished men into shadows. Now he lived far from where his name once mattered, so far that maps forgot his cabin existed. It sat at the edge of a pine-choked valley, roof sagging under years of snow and neglect, chimney coughing, smoke like a dying man's last breath. No one came here unless they were lost, or looking for something lost. Reuben didn't believe he deserved company, not after what he'd done. That's why the only living soul he shared the silence with was Jasper, his aging hound with a blind left eye and a limp that never quite healed. The two of them moved like ghosts around the cabin, slow, deliberate, saying little, listening to the wind instead of the world. He didn't fear justice. He feared remembering. Each morning, he chopped wood as if punishing the past. Each night, he sat beside the fire, trying to convince himself he had done the only thing he could. But deep down, he knew better. The fire knew too. It listened, crackled, judged. There's something uniquely cruel about a man who isolates not because the world rejected him, but because he rejected the world. Reuben had disappeared into the woods not to hide from people, but from the mirror. He couldn't face the face that looked back. I've known men like Reuben, not necessarily thieves or swindlers, but men broken by shame. Some were fathers who raised their voices one too many times. Others were husbands who buried secrets. Some were sons who walked away from responsibilities and never turned back. The specifics change, but the soul remains familiar. Worn down, haunted, quietly desperate for a redemption they're too afraid to chase. Reuben Clay wasn't evil. He wasn't heartless. He was simply a man who made a decision that cost others dearly, and once the cost was clear, he lacked the courage to pay it. So he paid with silence instead. The days bled into years. The forest grew around him. The newspapers stopped printing his name. But he never truly disappeared, not to the people he left behind, and not to himself. Because guilt is a terrible house guest. It doesn't knock, it doesn't leave, and it sleeps where you sleep. So when the knock came that stormy evening, three sharp raps against the wood, firm and deliberate, Reuben didn't flinch because he was surprised. He flinched because he wasn't. Some part of him had always known. The past was coming, and it had finally found the path through the trees. The storm didn't come as a whisper. It came like a verdict. The clouds hung low and heavy. The wind roared with an anger only nature knows. And the rain fell in sheets so thick it erased the world beyond Reuben Clay's porch. Inside the cabin, the fire hissed against the draft. Flickering like it too, sensed something was coming. Reuben stood at the window, fingers tight around the mug in his hand, his knuckles white. He'd seen many storms in 8 years, but this one felt different. This one felt personal, as if the sky itself had decided it was time for him to answer for what he'd buried. Then he saw them, three silhouettes forming from the blur of rain. Women, walking side by side, unfazed by mud or wind or thunder. They didn't hesitate, didn't shield their faces. They moved like they'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Reuben's heart began to pound, not with fear, but with recognition he couldn't yet place. The first to step onto the porch was tall, commanding. Mara Ellison. She removed her hood slowly, dark hair plastered to her face, her eyes steady and unwavering. Behind her came Junia, younger, more delicate in frame, but not in gaze. She clutched a satchel to her chest like it was sacred. Then Evelyn, older than the other two, yet colder than both. Her eyes scanned the cabin with calculated detachment, as though measuring the dimensions of a coffin. They didn't wait for him to open the door. Mara raised her fist and knocked, 3 times. Clean, measured, final. Reuben didn't mean to move. His body betrayed him, stepping toward the door before his mind could stop it. Something old stirred in his chest. Not curiosity, but dread. Something primal, something that knew. This wasn't coincidence. He opened the door, and the moment he did, the years he had spent hiding evaporated. Reuben Clay, Mara said, not asked, said, just his name. No anger, no explanation. But hearing it, spoken aloud for the first time in nearly a decade, hit him like a blow to the gut. The name he had tried to bury was now rising from the lips of a stranger who clearly knew everything. His mouth opened to respond, but nothing came. Mara didn't flinch. She stepped inside without permission. Junia followed like a shadow, and Evelyn brought up the rear, her presence chilling the cabin more than the storm outside ever could. They filled his home without saying a word. They didn't take off their wet coats, didn't offer apologies, didn't act like guests. They stood like sentries carrying not weapons, but something far sharper, truth. And Reuben knew. They hadn't come seeking shelter. They'd come to settle a score. They didn't ask to sit. They simply did. Mara in the chair across from the fireplace, Evelyn by the window like a sentinel, and Junia on the floor, cross-legged, still holding that weather-worn satchel as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the log walls. Reuben stood motionless, the door still open behind him, rain misting his shoulders. This was no longer his home, not tonight. Mara broke the silence first. You were good at your job, Reuben. People liked you, trusted you. You wore that suit like armor and smiled like a man who believed in something. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. And maybe you did, before the numbers stopped adding up. Reuben said nothing. His throat was dry. There was no point in denying what they already knew, what they had likely rehearsed 1,000 times on their long journey here. Evelyn spoke next, her voice low and cold. Silver Creek trusted you. My father trusted you. Reuben turned his eyes away. You remember September 15th, don't you? She asked. The day the bank closed early? The day the ledgers disappeared, and the office door was left swinging in the wind? Reuben shut the door behind him slowly, as if doing so might delay the inevitable. They didn't wait for his answer. Junia opened her satchel and pulled out a stack of faded documents, carefully unfolded like precious heirlooms. Mrs. Henderson lost her land that day, she whispered. Her husband died trying to build that farm. You remember her? She used to bring you pies. Reuben winced. She scrubbed clothes for saloon girls after you left, Mara added, until her hands bled from lye and cold water. Another paper, another life. The Morrison family, Junia continued. 4 children, a canvas tent for a roof, 2 winters in the dirt. One didn't make it. Silence. Even the fire seemed to still for a moment. Reuben lowered himself into the armchair by the hearth, though the warmth did little to thaw the weight settling into his bones. He looked at Junia. She couldn't be more than 22 now, which meant she'd only been a child when it all fell apart. Then she said the words that split him open. Our father trusted you. Her voice cracked, fragile and filled with a decade of silence. Evelyn stepped in with the knife of truth. 3 months later, he took his own life. A heartbeat passed, then another blow. My son, he was 2, died of fever and cold. We buried him next to my father. The room was too small for this kind of grief. Reuben felt his lungs fight for air, as if sorrow itself had taken the space. He told himself over the years that it was only money, that no one died, that people recovered, but the firelight didn't lie, and neither did their eyes. Now he saw it clearly. The theft hadn't been from bank accounts. It had been from lives, from futures, from dignity and hope. They weren't here for revenge. They were here to show him the truth, to make him see the ripple effect of his cowardice. Not just in paper and coin, but in hunger, in graves, in children who would never grow old. They weren't shouting, they weren't crying. That was what made it worse. They had already mourned. Now they had come to deliver the mirror, and Reuben had no choice but to look. The cabin grew smaller with every breath Reuben took. The log walls, once comforting in their solitude, now seemed to lean inward. The fire that had warmed him for years no longer offered heat, only flickering reminders of everything he'd tried to forget. He paced, not with purpose but with panic, like a caged wolf circling the invisible bars of his guilt. Every step echoed with memory. Every glance at the women reminded him of betrayal. He passed the table where he'd once forged those contracts, his hands shaking not from regret, but from the fear of being caught. He remembered thinking, I'll fix this later, just need to buy some time. But later never came. Time ran and so did he. He traded other people's hope for his own escape, and now that bill had come due. The Ellison sisters didn't raise their voices. They didn't beg or threaten. They simply existed in his space like ghosts that refused to leave. Mara sat composed as if she had been born for this confrontation. Evelyn leaned by the window, arms crossed, a storm behind her eyes. Junia was silent, her fingers tracing the fabric of her satchel over and over, as though touching memory itself. Reuben wished they'd yell. He could survive anger, but not this awful patience. This stillness that told him they didn't need to speak. They were letting him drown in the truth on his own. And it was working. He felt it settle deep into his bones, cold and final. He had lied to himself for so long, told himself he was hiding from the world, from the law, from angry townsfolk with pitchforks. But now he saw the truth. He'd been running from his reflection, because the worst part of being a coward is knowing it. He turned toward Mara. You want me to say it, don't you? He said, voice rough, barely more than a whisper. She didn't answer, just nodded once, and that was enough. He sat down slowly in the chair across from her, the same chair he'd always taken his coffee in, the same place he'd stared at flames for 8 years and tried to convince himself he wasn't a monster. My name is Reuben Clay, he began, his voice shaking. Junia looked up. I lied. I stole. I ruined lives, he said, and I ran. Not because I was afraid of prison, but because I couldn't look anyone in the eye, especially myself. The fire popped and no one moved. Evelyn turned her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable. I told myself it was just money, he continued, but it wasn't. It was people's futures. It was your father, your family, that little boy, your son. His throat closed. I'm sorry, he said, not just for what I did, but for not saying it sooner, for hiding while you all carried what I caused. Mara's eyes didn't soften, but they blinked once, slowly, purposefully. And in that blink, Reuben saw it. They didn't want revenge. They wanted the world to remember their father didn't die because he was naive, but because he believed in someone who didn't deserve it. And Reuben, he finally saw it too, not in their eyes, but in his own. What do you want from me? Reuben asked, his voice brittle from hours of silence. Mara didn't move. Her voice was steady, controlled, deadly in its calm. We want the truth, not whispered into your firelight, not buried in some remote journal. We want the world to hear it, the same world you stole from. Reuben leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands gripping each other tight enough to turn his knuckles white. You want justice? Evelyn answered this time, her tone like ice across skin. We had justice in our hands 3 years ago. Documents, affidavits, witnesses. We could have turned you in. Why didn't you? He asked. Because prison is clean, she said. Too clean. Junia pulled something from her satchel. A journal. Bound in cracked leather, the pages yellowed with age and smudged with years of silent regret. She held it out, not like a threat, but like a dare. You write it all, she said. Start tonight. Every lie, every signature, every person you hurt. Reuben stared at the journal like it was on fire. And then, Mara continued, you walk into Silver Creek and you speak those words out loud, in the square, to their faces. That's suicide, Reuben whispered. They'll kill me. Maybe, Evelyn said coldly. But our father didn't get a chance to explain. He died believing he was a fool. That shame killed him. You at least get a voice. Reuben didn't respond. His hands trembled as he took the journal from Junia's outstretched fingers. It was heavier than it looked. He opened it slowly, flipping past the empty pages until he found the first blank line. The fire crackled beside him. He stared at the page, his mind blank. And then, he wrote, I stole from people who trusted me, and I buried their lives to build my own. The words stared back at him, small, final, true. He didn't expect applause, and he didn't get it. But something shifted in the room. Not warmth, not forgiveness, but perhaps for a moment, recognition. Junia looked at him not with sympathy, but something else. Confirmation. She had come here to face a monster. Now she saw a man, a broken one, but a man nonetheless. You write until the sun rises, Mara said. Then we walk. No shortcuts. No delays. Reuben nodded. I have some money stashed, he said weakly. Not enough to fix what I broke. But maybe we don't want your money, Evelyn interrupted sharp. We want your voice, your shame, your truth. That's all that's left to give. He closed the journal, set it gently beside the fire. Why are you giving me a choice? He asked. Mara stood, eyes fixed on him. Because justice without choice is revenge, she said, and we came here for more than revenge. Reuben looked between the three sisters, Mara standing like a judge, Evelyn unmoved but no longer unreadable, and Junia, the youngest, watching him not with hate, but with consequence. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. He picked up the journal again, pulled a pen from the drawer, and began to write. His confession had begun, and with it, so had his reckoning. The storm had finally broken. The sky, once torn by thunder and grief, now stretched pale and wide over the valley, like a breath held too long, finally exhaled. The forest shimmered with dew, washed clean, but Reuben Clay knew better. Some things don't wash away. He stood at the edge of his porch, staring out at the land he'd called home for 8 years. The soil was damp, the pines quiet, and the sky tinged with a golden hue that made the world seem almost merciful. But there was no mercy in his step as he slung a small satchel over his shoulder. Inside only the journal. No gun, no heirlooms, not even Jasper, the dog who had once followed him everywhere. Reuben had told him to stay. Some journeys aren't meant to be witnessed. He turned to the three sisters. They stood waiting, silent, composed, resolute. No goodbyes were exchanged. They simply followed him down the path. The road to Silver Creek was long and lined with memory. With each mile, Reuben thought about the faces he'd stolen from, the voices he'd silenced, the families left to bleed out behind him while he hid in the trees. The town hadn't changed much. Dusty signs, rusted hinges, boots in muddy streets. But the air shifted when he walked in. People looked. Some froze, some whispered. Mothers pulled children behind their skirts. An old man narrowed his eyes and spat on the ground as Reuben passed. He deserved worse. The town square was quiet when he arrived. No bells, no sheriff. Just silence, hanging heavy as if the town itself was holding its breath. The wooden platform outside the courthouse waited like a noose-less gallows. Reuben stepped onto it, slowly, deliberately. He took the journal from his bag and opened it with trembling fingers, pages filled with ink, regret, and the pieces of a man trying to become whole again. He cleared his throat once. It echoed across the square like thunder never left. My name is Reuben Clay, he said. No one interrupted. I stole what wasn't mine. I ruined lives to protect my own. I lied. I betrayed. I ran. He paused, looked up at the people gathering, faces like stone. I can't give back what I took, but I can give you this, the truth, and the promise that I'll carry it every day that remains. Junia stood in the crowd now, her satchel clutched to her chest, Evelyn by her side. Mara, arms crossed, unreadable. Reuben took a deep breath. This is the truth, he said again, louder, and I have nothing left but to give it back, piece by piece, word by word. Some in the crowd scoffed. A few crossed their arms, but none walked away. Because justice doesn't always look like gallows. Sometimes it looks like a man who finally stopped running, who finally stood still, who finally faced what he'd become and chose to be more. Redemption doesn't erase the past, but sometimes, just sometimes, it's enough to name it. Not all the faces in the crowd were strangers. Some carried the weight of history, others carried its scars. As Reuben stood on the courthouse platform, speaking his confession into the still morning air, he began to see them, not as a mob, not as accusers, but as fragments of the truth he'd tried to bury. And each one had a name. Frank had once owned the general store on the corner of Main and Cedar, a proud man with a crooked smile and a love for lemon candy. He ran his shop with care, greeting every customer by name, sometimes extending credit when times were hard, especially for the Henderson widow or the Morrison kids. When the bank collapsed and the savings accounts vanished, so did the trust that held Silver Creek together. Frank lost everything. His suppliers pulled out, the townspeople struggling themselves and stopped buying. The store shuttered within 3 months. His wife left not long after. Now Frank swept floors in the saloon just to keep a roof over his daughters' heads. As Reuben stepped down from the platform, Frank met his eyes. "My daughter asks why we live in one room now," he said quietly. "What should I tell her?" Reuben had no answer, because there wasn't one. Miss Hart had taught generations of children in Silver Creek. Her classroom was a sanctuary, filled with handmade charts, stories about far-off lands, and the smell of old chalk and wood polish. She was the kind of teacher children remembered forever and parents trusted without hesitation. Eliza had invested her modest life savings with Reuben, believing his promises of safety and interest. She had no family, no pension, just the quiet dignity of a woman who had given her life to service. When the truth of Reuben's betrayal surfaced, Eliza lost her savings and her reputation. The school board removed her quietly, citing mismanagement, though no one dared say whose mismanagement it really was. Now, she taught in an abandoned barn on the outskirts of town, offering lessons for free to the children whose families could no longer afford school books. Reuben spotted her in the back of the crowd, her gray hair pinned neatly, her hands clasped. She didn't speak, but he could still hear her voice in his mind. "I used to teach children the meaning of integrity. You taught them what it doesn't look like." Gideon Hale had taken Reuben under his wing when he was just a fresh-faced young man with ambition in his step and hunger in his eyes. Gideon, a retired banker himself, taught Reuben how to read risk, understand people, and navigate pressure with grace. He trusted Reuben too much. When the collapse came, many assumed Gideon had been involved. His name was tarnished by association. Clients whispered, friends withdrew, and the man who had spent 40 years building respect watched it crumble in the shadow of someone else's mistake. Gideon didn't leave town. He stayed. But he never returned to the bank, and the last years of his life were spent alone in a small house, writing letters he never sent, waiting for a phone call that never came. He died without ever receiving an apology. Reuben learned of his passing only months later, through a letter from a clerk who used to sort Gideon's mail. The next day, Reuben walked the trail behind the church, placed a stone at Gideon's unmarked grave, and whispered, "I was the mistake, not you." It was the first time he cried since the day he ran. These weren't just stories. They were consequences. They weren't dramatic courtroom tales or headlines in newspapers. They were the quiet devastations, the kind that unfolds slowly over years, the kind that turn fathers into janitors, teachers into outcasts, mentors into ghosts. That was the real legacy of Reuben Clay. Not the money lost, but the trust, the dignity, the years. And that was why he stood there, journal in hand, confession on his lips. Because redemption, if it ever came, would not be a gift. It would be earned, name by name, pain by pain. Though Reuben Clay's story is fiction, the lessons it holds are painfully real and deeply familiar. In today's world, we still see men and women who run from accountability, some in boardrooms, some in our own families. But the truth is, the past never really stays buried. Not in small towns, not in big cities, not in the human heart. What Reuben teaches us is simple, yet profound. Redemption doesn't come from erasing mistakes. It comes from owning them. And maybe you've known someone like Reuben, a friend, a brother, a neighbor who disappeared not because they were evil, but because they didn't know how to face what they'd done. Or maybe you see a piece of Reuben in yourself. In American culture, we often celebrate strength as never backing down. But sometimes true strength is walking into the town square of your life, standing still and telling the truth, even when it costs you everything. So here's a question for you. Do you think Reuben deserved forgiveness? If you were in Silver Creek that day, would you have clapped or turned away? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing for more stories that go deeper than just entertainment. Thank you for listening, truly, because sometimes standing still is the bravest thing a man can do. Until next time, stay honest, stay human, and don't be afraid to stand still.